Hello and welcome to the Epitome. I am your host, Nathan Bozeman, and today we're going to be doing an introduction on the Synoptic Problem. What is that? Let's get into it. I just read a book on the Synoptic Problem. I'm going to bring it up real close so you guys can see. There's 4 views in this volume by Craig Evans, Mark Goodacre, David Barrett Peabody, and Rainer Reisner. They're going to be defending 4 different views and answers to the Synoptic Problem. And I'm basically just going to go through the introduction of this book so that you can kind of get an idea of what the Synoptic Problem is. And then I highly recommend this book if you want to know the 4 main views in the scholarship on this topic. To give a quick summary of the Synoptic Problem, scholars for some time have recognized that the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are somehow related to one another. Was one Gospel written first and used by the other 2? Did all 3 Gospels share common sources or traditions? Did the Gospel writers borrow or copy from one another? How do we explain the abundance of shared material, and often exact wording found in the Synoptics? The inquiry into the relationship among the Synoptic Gospels, usually on the literary level, has commonly been called the Synoptic Problem. And if you're unfamiliar with the Synoptic Problem, that might seem like a weird quote. Why are they asking if the Synoptic Gospel authors copied from one another or used the same sources? Well, we're going to get into 4 reasons and 4 categories for why many scholars believe that to be the case from the introduction of the book I mentioned earlier. We can break it down to shared material because many of the same stories are told in the Synoptic Gospels, and in those shared stories, the wording is often very similar and sometimes verbatim. And then we have the order of pericope, and if you're unfamiliar with this word, that just means like a passage that could be pulled out and stand on its own, kind of like a parable of Jesus or a specific story that could be taken out and stand on its own as its own like narrative. And finally, we have editorial comments and decisions that seem to point to literary dependence and are hard to explain via chance. And it wouldn't be much of an introduction if I didn't show you what I was talking about, so here are some examples of shared material or the same stories that are told in all of the Synoptic Gospels. This is also called the triple tradition. All right, so we've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke, verses for each column, and here are the stories. Jesus' baptism is told in Matthew 3, Mark 1, and Luke 3. Peter's confession is in Matthew 16, Mark 8, and Luke 9. Judas' betrayal is Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22. And Jesus' trial before Pilate, Matthew 27, Mark 15, and Luke 23. That was just a small portion of the triple tradition. That was 4 examples, but there are actually 11 listed in the book. So there are a lot more stories that are shared within the triple tradition. And you might be thinking to yourself, why is this a problem? Why do scholars call this the Synoptic Problem at all? Well, the answer is because, think about it. If you were following a guy for 3 years, and there were stories from that whole 3-year period, and then you had 3 guys independently sit down and write down what they remember from that time period, it's very unlikely that they would all choose the same exact stories, don't you think? And if you look at the shared material within the triple tradition, talking about the wording and how close it is, you'll begin to see it gets even weirder. So here is one example, and there are many others like it in the Synoptic Gospels, but this is from Matthew 21, Mark 11, and Luke 20. We can see in all 3 that he goes into the temple, or he's teaching in the temple. The chief priests and elders and scribes come up to him and ask him, by what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority? See how all of them use almost verbatim wording when asking him, by what authority are you doing all of these miracles and all of these teachings that he had just been doing? So far, we've covered the fact that the Synoptic Gospels share many of the exact same stories, and then on top of that, within those same stories, they have almost verbatim wording or very similar wording. But it gets even deeper. They have the order of the stories in the exact same order as well. Here we have 5 different examples in the triple tradition, being Peter's confession, Jesus predicts his death, transfiguration, Jesus heals the boy, and true greatness. And remember, there are 11 examples in the triple tradition, and for all of them, they all appear in the same order. So check this out. Matthew 16, 13 through 20, then it goes 21 through 23. Then chapter 17, 1 through 9, then 17, 14 through 21, then 18, 1 through 5. Same thing with Mark, these same exact events. 8, 27 to 30, 8, 31 to 33, 9, 2 to 10, 9, 14 to 29. You guys get the picture. It's going to be the same thing for Luke. And this is what we're talking about when we say that not only do the triple tradition have shared material, on top of that, they have almost exact or verbatim wording in that shared material, and then they tell those stories in the exact same order as well. If you're still not convinced that they either copied one another or used each other as sources, well, hopefully this last one will put the nail in the coffin for you. Right here, when telling the same story, when you see the desolating sacrilege, and you'll see at the end, then those in Judea must flee the mountains, right here in the exact same spot, Matthew and Luke put the exact same editorial comment. Let the reader understand. Hopefully you're beginning to see why scholars think that the Synoptic Gospels use one another as sources, and they're trying to understand the relationship between them. I'm going to now get into those 4 views that are mentioned in the book, and then I highly recommend you picking it up if you are interested. And by the way, I'm not getting paid by the people in this book. I just really thought it was good, and so I'm just going through the introduction so that you guys can kind of get a feel for what you can expect to read as you go through the different views. So the first proposed answer to the synoptic problem is the favorite in the scholarship. This is what most scholars believe today. This is the 2-source hypothesis, the 2 sources being Mark and Q. And you can see that there's an arrow pointing from Mark to Matthew and to Luke, and arrows pointing from Q to Matthew and to Luke. And so these are the 2 sources that kind of feed into Matthew and Luke. And so the theory is, since about 90% of Mark is in Matthew, and about 50% of Mark is in Luke, that basically Matthew and Luke used Mark as their outline, and that explains why the stories are so similar, the wording is so similar. Basically, Matthew would have used 90% of Mark, and then he would have added sayings from Jesus, he would have added different teachings from Jesus, either from this source Q, or another source that is called Special M, which is just the things found in Matthew, because Q is meant to explain the shared material between Matthew and Luke that is not in Mark. So that's the point of Q. Basically, there are stories and parables and narratives that are found in Matthew and Luke that are not found in Mark, and they have very similar qualities as well. They have very similar language. They're told in a pretty similar order. And so it's hypothesized that Q is a second source that was utilized by Matthew and Luke. And that is going to be our first theory and most popular theory held in the scholarship, and that is defended in the book by Craig Evans. Secondly, we have the fairer hypothesis, which is defended in the book by Mark Goodacre. And this is considered like a simpler hypothesis than the first one we looked at. Mark is still considered the first gospel written. However, Mark was used by Matthew, and then Matthew and Mark was used by Luke. And so this just kind of removes Q and says that Mark was written first, and that's why 90% of Mark is in Matthew and 50% of Mark is in Luke. However, to explain the material that's in Matthew and Luke, they kind of just remove the Q source and say, well, that can be explained by the fact that Luke used Matthew as well. And so this is the fairer hypothesis, and he gives his own arguments, Mark Goodacre that is, and he defends what he calls editorial fatigue, which is an argument that he's famous for in this argument. And so that was a really cool addition to his article. Up next is the 2 gospel hypothesis, and what separates this hypothesis from the other 2 we've looked at so far is that Matthew is said to be written first. Luke used Matthew directly as a source, kind of like the fairer hypothesis that we just looked at, and then Mark conflated the narratives of Matthew and Luke, which is to say he kind of combined the 2 and then made a shorter version of it. And that's why Mark is so short compared to the other 2. And the reason they give is they say that Matthew and Luke were meant to be written to Christians who already believed and wanted to get like a deeper understanding of Jesus' teachings, and they wanted to, study and go in depth. And Mark was written almost like a sermon, because you could read Mark from start to finish in about an hour. And so they basically think that Mark was meant to just be a condensed version of the gospel for people to go preach to unbelievers to kind of get them interested in the teachings of Jesus. And then they would get them the Gospels of Matthew and Luke and later John in order to really get them acquainted with Jesus. Oh yeah, and I almost forgot to mention, in the book, this hypothesis is defended by David Barrett Peabody. Last but not least, we're going to get into the orality and memory hypothesis, which is defended by Rainer Reisner in the volume that I showed you. And honestly, this hypothesis is a little bit harder to understand, and so I'm just going to be upfront about that. So If someone hears this and maybe could explain it clearly in the comments, that would be really helpful. But I'm going to do my best here. Basically, this hypothesis holds that oral tradition plays a much bigger role in explaining why the Synoptic Gospels have such similar content and similar wording, because basically they remembered the teachings word for word. So in the first century, around the time of Jesus, Greek philosophers as well as Jewish philosophers would teach in something called kriya, which is like a saying that was easy to remember, and they would kind of word it in like a poem almost. So a lot of Jesus's parables, if you kind of put them in Hebrew, you can almost arrange them in poetic form and poetic prose to make them easier to remember. And so the proto here, it stands for proto-Mark, which is kind of like what the oral tradition would be based on all of the kriya of Jesus and all of his teachings. And then you have other sources that play into all of the Gospels as well, kind of written down. So note-taking, he says, was a big part. So maybe Matthew and the other disciples were taking notes while Jesus was teaching over time. And then eventually that developed into these written sources. And then all the Gospels on this hypothesis were written independently of one another. But the reason they're so similar is because of this proto-Mark based on oral tradition and all these other sources like the disciples taking notes over time. So it just would have been very accurate because of the notes being taken during the ministry of Jesus. And that'll do it for this very brief introduction into the Synoptic Problem. Again, I'm not being paid by the authors of this book. I just really enjoyed it and thought it was good. And I wanted to give you guys an introduction to the Synoptic Problem. I will put a link to the book in the description below. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Thanks so much for watching. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Subscribe to the channel if you're new and you want more content like this. This has been The Epitome. I'm your host, Nathan Bozeman. We'll see you around.